Well, this is a very interesting issue. Monetary union today is one of the major developments in the global economy. It is also very interesting because we are very concerned with what happens today due to COVID-19 in many of the countries, because a monetary union doesn't work without open borders. And as we know today, borders are almost closed, and it is quite difficult to get from one country to another, even inside monetary unions, which are, like I said, supposed to be open border unions, open border groupings of countries. They have introduced many restrictions for the movement of people inside these unions. The people of the European Union are free to move. This is according to the general treaty of the EU. Any citizen of an EU country may live anywhere they want. Whether it's France or Germany, you may go from Estonia to Germany to live, from Italy to France. It was even possible to go from Greece and Hungary to the UK, but the UK decided to leave the EU. So this is one more important development in these open border or closed border policies of today's. This is going to be a short series of lectures. Actually, we're going to speak, of course, about the European Union and what happened before the European Union was created. There are, of course, other monetary unions in the world finance, but they are so insignificant that I think it is very easy to neglect them, to omit them. And the majority of countries in the world either have some kind of preferential treaties in existence or just simple negotiating processes in trade and in the policy of most favored nations, or simple trade agreements for goods and services to be imported and exported. So they're not quite interested in creating a single currency. A single currency is an issue which is quite important only for most developed countries in the European Union, and the countries that are very close to each other in terms of economy, in terms of the labor market, in terms of agricultural policy, in terms of industrial policy, fiscal policy, and many other aspects of human life. Europe was divided for centuries. Countries in Europe fought for territories, mostly for colonies, when America was discovered. When they went to Africa, the French, the British, later Germany joined this struggle for the colonies in other countries in Asia, in Oceania, in Australia, and of course Europe is full of history of bloodshed and military warfare. That was a very difficult period to live, especially in the 20th century. and before that also. The European Union has a very, very long history before it was created. Well, many people in Europe, many politicians, many philosophers actually dreamed of something that would unite this very divided continent. There were always conflicts between most important nations. What are the most important nations in the EU? These most important nations include, of course, Germany, France, and Britain, which has always been apart from the continent and still is. There is always this issue on the continent and something which lies next to the English Channel. And what happens across this English Channel is quite different. Britain has always been thought of as a mother of parliaments, as a mother of democracy. However, democratic principles were common for many countries in Europe also. For example, the Holy Roman Empire of the German people. This is the state which was located in the middle of Europe, and it encompassed many countries, many princedoms, many kingdoms, and there was an emperor who tried to rule them, and this emperor was elected. So there were some democratic principles in the country which we today call Germany, and they predate actually what happened later on in Britain with its parliamentary system. Britain was created actually, and this state emerged when William the Conqueror went across the English Channel, and for 200 years, for 2 centuries, there was no English king on English throne. He spoke English. He spoke the language of the country. So they spoke something close to Old French, because they were born in Normandy. And this is also part of that great cosmopolitan idea that any country may be ruled by other people, and that's what's behind this whole migration process in Europe and inside Europe, from other countries to Europe, and from Europe to the rest of the world. Europe was known to be something which we know as the Old World. Later, when the Europeans discovered the New World and the United States was created, philosophers and politicians started thinking of something close that could be replicated and brought to Europe as well. And they started speaking about of the United States of Europe. Napoleon wanted something to accomplish in Europe as well. He was aware that Europe was always divided, and he wanted to create something close to this thing which I called, and which many philosophers called actually, the United States of Europe. But he wanted to do this by military force. He thought that it is really possible to use armies and unite people this way. But it led to oppression in other countries, and he abdicated from the French throne, and we all know that he ended his life on the Isle of St. Helena in the Atlantic. So this idea has broken. Then, of course, there were many other issues and many other historic examples in this divided continent. If you look at countries such as Austria, Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, parts of Romania, Serbia, Bulgaria, these countries in the 19th centuries united under one empire, and this empire was called the Austrian Empire. Today, Austria is a very small country, but in the 19th century it was the largest country in Europe. People of very different languages, of very different cultures, both Catholics among them, Protestants, Muslims, they were Islamists as well, of course. They were all united under one crown. And maybe you heard an emperor called Franz Joseph II, and he had a wife, Sisi, Elizabeth. He was killed by a terrorist, and that was a very tragic story, of course, but many films were filmed after that story because she was very famous for her democratic ideas about how this country could be organized. They had one currency, they had one army, and many people of this very divided country, including Serbs, Hungarians, Slovakians, Czechs, Germans, Austrians, they all served under the same ruler in the same army, they wore the same uniform, they used the same currency. That was a country, a free border, so to speak, union, where everyone could move across borders with no visas required. They could study in universities in Vienna. Even if you were a Jew, you could also study in Vienna, in some university. And there were many examples of Jews who became very important personages in this country. I know one such story, for example, Gustav Mahler, a very famous Austrian composer and conductor. He was a Jew, and he was not only a Jew, he also was of Judaism. So he believed Judaism. He was not a Catholic, he was not a Protestant. And he got educated in the Vienna University. He was a professional musician. He started writing musical pieces, symphonies, and someday he wanted to become a director of the Vienna Opera House. But to be a director of an opera house in Vienna, you needed to be a Christian. So that was a very important issue. So that was a very important point. So you could live anywhere in this country, but you could not be an official of high ranking without this one point, to be a Christian. And he, at the age of 25 or 30, decided to convert into Catholicism. He converted, and he became the director of the opera house in Vienna. There were, of course, many other issues. In Russia, actually, you also got to be a Christian in order to occupy some important government position. You could be anyone, of course, by nationality, whether it's Jew or a Turk, some person coming from Siberia. You could be a Muslim first, but you had to be Christian. And of course, I also spoke about a country called the Holy Roman Empire of the German people. And this country included parts of Germany, which was the heart of it. Of course, parts of France, which is Lotharingia, parts of Belgium, Netherlands, Denmark, parts of Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, northern Italy. Actually, Venice and Istria also belonged to the Austrian Empire. That's what I forgot to say. So that was actually, the Austrian Empire was really large. And close to the end of the 19th century, Austrian Empire lost its power, and Germany became at the heart of European politics. So there was first France. He united countries of Europe under the same rule, under the same emperor. Napoleon called himself the emperor. Then it was Austrian Empire, and now it's Germany. Britain never ruled in Europe. That was a very different country, apart from the continent. They had their own law, which is common law. In Europe they use continental law, civil law, Napoleon Code, this is called. We also in Russia use Napoleon Code. The civil law dates back to the Roman Emperor Justinian. He created that code, that civil code. And we still live with this law. Germany later declared itself as a supreme nation, not only in Europe but on Earth, and started 2 wars, World War I and World War II. And at this point, when Germany lost both wars, people in Europe started to realize that actually with military weapons, with tanks, with the munitions, it is impossible to create a long-standing union. And in 1950, on May the 9th, that is the 5th anniversary of the Victory Day, French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman invited the leaders of Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, Italy, to come to France, to Paris, to conclude an agreement. He said the idea of his was that Germany, he decided, I think he was a very clever politician, and the idea of the European integration could actually date back to his ideas. Maybe there were some other people, some other ideologists, but this is a very known fact that he was behind the creation of that pre-European Union, so to speak, which predates the European Union as we know it today. So he invited all those people, all those politicians to come to Paris on May the 9th, 1950. And he wanted these countries to unite under an agreement, which we know today, the European Agreement on Coal and Steel. This may sound very strange, what these coal and steel have to do with European integration. But this was a very clever idea of his. Actually, what made Germany always fight against other countries? This was, of course, coal, and coal was a raw material to produce steel, and steel was a material to produce tanks, bombs, etc. And he said, we should actually, it is very good if we share those interests, if we share those resources, so that your people come to my country to work, my people will go to your country to work, and we will share these profits and everyone will prosper. That was a very simple idea. These 6 countries, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Italy, and West Germany. West Germany because, well, there were 2 Germanys in those days. The Eastern Germany, DDR, Deutsche Demokratische Republik, and BRD, which is today's Germany as well, Bundesrepublik Deutschland. So those 2 countries, and they had their own currencies, of course. Those countries, which were called, Germany was famous to have before that Reichmarks, which later were called Deutschmarks, DMs. And this currency was a symbol of an economic miracle that happened after that, after Germany was devastated after the Second World War. So this union helped Germany to recover from the economic crisis, from the devastations of the Second World War, World War II. It also helped other European countries. There were many investments, investment projects in Europe, including the Marshall Plan, and the United States was behind the Marshall Plan. There were high-tech things, there were many goods and services. Germany was allowed to sell armaments to Korea to fight there. And actually, this is one point. So besides the fact that people, I said that people in Europe realized that with weapons it is impossible to bring peace and development, but still there were countries, again, those countries who fought in World War II, who were defeated, and still Germany supplied armaments and munitions to Korea. And we all know that there were, again, a harsh war between the North and the South. Soviet Union participated in the war. Japan, that was also devastated after the Second World War. And after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, only before that, 5 years ago, in 1945, these both events, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and just 5 years after that, Japan was allowed by the United States to supply armaments to Korea again for the bloodshed. And that one point is considered to be a starting point for economic miracles both in Germany and Japan. Japan and Germany started their skyrocketing career in world economy on that particular day when the Korean War started in 1950. They really prospered. So the export economy, the model of export-oriented economy, is the most successful model. And this is a very, I should really make a distinction here. So not only the European agreement brought prosperity to Europe, but also an export-oriented economy, because countries of Europe started exporting heavily to other countries. They sold goods and services and got hard currency. Hard currency, that means US dollars. They sold their goods, got dollars. Dollar was converted into gold, because they still lived, the world back then still lived on the Bretton Woods system. And the Bretton Woods system was a system where dollar was pegged to gold at $35 an ounce of gold. And so when you got dollars, you could exchange those dollars into gold and store gold instead of dollars. And this is what Japan, Germany, and all other exporting nations did. This is the reason behind German mark's rise in the world monetary system and in the world. And Germany started, despite the fact that Germany, with its idea of a supreme nation before World War II, and despite this defeat in World War II, so this country actually became again the locomotive of Europe and an example for other countries. So each and every country in Europe started to model their economies looking at Germany. So I think that one point at the end of the lecture, please. This one point was very important for the European integration and the starting point. This is the reason why Germany is looked upon as a supreme leader still today. And everyone in Europe consults Germany on most important issues. If there is trouble in Greece, everyone goes to Germany and asks for money. And if something happens in Italy, also they go to Germany, try to negotiate some bonds in order to recover from the debt crisis. And everything goes back to Germany, although Germany in particular is not responsible for anything, of course. They are responsible for their economy. They do not want to be responsible for anyone. So each country in Europe lived in this agreement, yeah? Not each country, 6 countries. And like I said, they started thinking about, if we join this union as well, we will be prosperous as well. And other countries started thinking of joining this agreement of a European agreement on coal and steel. And in 1956, they met in Rome. Yeah, they met in Rome and concluded the Treaty of Rome. And this Treaty of Rome established the European Economic Community, EEC. European Economic Community, EEC, yeah. And that was the point when they started thinking that all goods and services should go across borders freely, without any restrictions. But they still had their own currencies, yeah? Germany had their own German marks, Deutschmarks. Spain, Spanish pesos. France, French francs. Belgium, Belgium francs. Luxembourg used Belgium francs as well, because they had a union which was called, and still is called today, Benelux. Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. And that was an economic union, and they used the same currency, which was Belgium francs. Then, of course, Austria had guldens. Italy had liras. Greece had drachmas. Each and every country in Europe had their own currency. There were exchange rates, of course, of each currency to each other. They were exchanged according to some principles, market principles, of course. When currencies were traded on local stock exchanges, they had their own central banks that issued those currencies. By 1968, countries in Europe and politicians decided that it was too early to speak about free movement of goods and services across borders. So, 12 years passed, and they understood that the customs union, which they thought was possible in 1956, was actually only on paper, and nobody observed it to the whole extent. And in 1968, they decided to put an end to that, and really developed a union which was called the Customs Union. So they abolished many tariffs and started this exchange of goods and services on a larger scale. But still, it took decades for most restrictions to abolish, because and even still today, I read sometimes articles about these about the updates of the customs policies in the European Union, and many analysts and economists say that whole custom union, a full custom union, fully employable customs union does not work still today, because you may produce wine and tomatoes in Bulgaria and export it to Germany, but nobody will allow you to sell it there. So you just that will be a waste of time and waste of products, waste of money. You can produce wine in Bulgaria or cheese in Bulgaria, tomatoes, but the European market is only open to tomatoes from Italy, wine from Spain and France, cheese from Switzerland, and so this market is very, very strictly regulated, and it is very difficult to enter this market, despite the fact that actually, according to any treaty that was concluded, they have this free flow of goods and services across borders. But this is not so. In practical terms, in practice, this is very, very difficult. And when they started thinking about the Ukraine being join this European Union, and they were so happy about that, so that they could export their products to the European Union, this is complete nonsense. Nobody in Europe will allow that. So it may join the European Union, but nobody in Europe will allow that, because, like I said, we buy tomatoes in Italy, wine in Spain and Portugal, France as well, milk in Germany, because if they start doing this, they immediately there break French bottles in Italy, throw French and Bulgarian tomatoes on the streets, rotten tomatoes, of course, just into politicians, and they even waste milk, and the milk flows sometimes in tons and millions of liters on the streets in Germany, because they express protests against some kind of agricultural policy that does not satisfy local farmers, local subsidies. So this is a very, very serious issue. This customs union is not the customs union in the real sense of the word. But the politicians, the cosmopolitan politicians, with their cosmopolitan ideas behind the European Union and more closer union, ever closer Europe, that was the great formula. The United States of Europe was still in existence, and they thought that maybe in order to get countries closer, we should really make a single currency. That was a very ambitious project, and for some it was absolutely unbelievable and unthinkable. Just think about Germany after World War II, after those devastations, and with that German marks, that was a world currency like US dollar. It was used almost like the US dollar. It was stored in central banks across the world. Even TV show, Russian TV show Поле чудес, which is shown on Russian on First Channel. So in the early 1990s, this is very, very maybe funny to speak about and say, but they priced their electronics and goods which they got as prizes there on this TV show in German marks, not in dollars, not in rubles, but in Deutschmarks. That was absolutely, today this is absolutely unthinkable. If you visited Russian shops in the early 1990s, prices were expressed in uye, which meant dollars, because ruble was a very exotic currency, because it devalued several times, and hyperinflation was also very great in Russia in those days. So he could think in Germany about giving up this currency, which is one of the hardest currencies in the world. So that was absolutely unbelievable. But still, there was a very important event which happened close to that single currency idea. And this event, I think, precipitated, it triggered for Europe to come closer to the establishment of the monetary union. This event happened on August 19th, 1971. On this particular day, US President Richard Nixon went on air and said that the United States of America temporarily abolishes a free exchange of US dollars into gold and of gold into US dollars. That was the end of the Bretton Woods Agreement. This temporary ban, temporary abolishment, as you know, lasts for over 4 decades now, and we live in the world monetary system, which is still today called the Jamaican Agreement. This Jamaican Agreement was created on Jamaica, as the name implies, on Jamaica, in Kingston. This Kingston Agreement was signed in 1976. So these both events, the abolishment of this gold peg of the US dollar to gold, and this free floating exchange rate regime, free floating exchange rate regime, where currencies were allowed to freely move, and this regime was called free float. So currencies became flexible. These two events led countries in Europe to think about a currency that would stabilize exchange rate fluctuations. Just imagine Germany sold its goods and services, got dollars in exchange, they stored dollars, they gave gold to the US Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, in exchange for dollars in order to trade across the world. And now, what happened? These Americans, these nasty Yankees, they abolished this fixed exchange rate. We exchanged US dollar at $35 an ounce of gold. Now I got to pay $200 and $300 to buy the same amount of gold. This is absolutely unfair. So it means that European countries, include most of all Germany, France, and also Japan, who exported many goods and services to other countries as well, they all suffered great losses due to that one step on part of the US government back in 1971, and they lost much money. And they decided that we should put an end to this in Europe. And in 1979, this is the year, they created the European monetary system. And this European monetary system was supposed to use a new currency. Its exchange rate was supposed to be built based on a basket of currencies of the member states of the European Economic Community. And they pegged their currencies, and these currencies were allowed to fluctuate inside very strict borders. But still they were allowed to fluctuate. It was possible. And this currency they called ECU, ECU, which stands for the European Currency Unit. Germany was, before I turn to Germany, just one more word about this ECU currency. This ECU currency was never issued. So this was only an electronic currency, so to speak. Of course, nobody knew about digital economy in those days. There was no process called, which we call today, digitization. And that was impossible in those days. Nobody knew about that. But this currency was really existed only in numbers. That was actually the idea of John Maynard Keynes. He was present at the Bretton Woods conference. He wanted the whole world except a single currency, which he called BANCOR, banking corresponding account. But nobody took in account his idea. They thought that was impossible and unthinkable to do. So everyone decided for the US dollar. That was in 1944. And now it's 1979. Germany disliked most of all this currency, the name of it, because it had a French sounding in it. ECU was an old French currency, which was used before French francs. When there were kings and queens in France, so they used this currency. Louis d'ors and ECUs, which is a smaller currency, like in Russia, kopecks or cents in the United States, a smaller currency. But one country in the European Union, in the European Economic Community, decided to issue this currency. And this is a museum thing. So you can find that only in museums or some private collections. And this country is called Luxembourg. Like I said, Luxembourg still today is included in the union called Benelux. And they, before 1979, used Belgian francs as a currency, as a national currency. They had no currency, national currency, their own currency. And they were so enthusiastic and so happy about the introduction of the ECU that they immediately issued this currency, and they issued banknotes and coins. But this is a very rare example. No other country in Europe did that as well. But this country was this small country. Sometimes small countries are very patriotic about being independent. They want to show that they are independent, and that's why they call themselves names such as very long names. This is a very small country, I mean Luxembourg, a very small country. You got to use a microscope in order to find it on the map of Europe. But they call themselves the Great Dukedom of Luxembourg. The Great Dukedom of Luxembourg. Yeah, just like the Holy Empire of the German nation. Yeah, very too many words to call it simply Germany, something like that. Well, that was 1979, and that was a coup. This currency used mostly by the central banks of the member states and was never issued. So they continued to use their national currencies instead. People used liras, Deutschmarks, francs to exchange goods and services inside their countries. Of course, foreign currency was not accepted, so you could not go from Germany to Italy and use Deutschmarks to pay for goods and services. That was unthinkable. That was not allowed. In order to put an end to that, in order to really establish a monetary union, they met in Maastricht. This is a city in the Netherlands, and they wanted to create a real monetary union that would lead to the creation of a single currency. And they, of course, wanted to use a coup as a model for that currency. So that was back in 1991. The Maastricht Treaty, as we know it today, was signed on January the 1st, 1993. And it had, so now, we no longer had the European Economic Community. We now had European Union. EEC became EU, the European Union. So that meant free exchange of goods and services, free movement of people and labor, the common economic policy, the common market, common customs union, common everything, yeah? Only no single currency. In 1995, in Madrid, in Spain, the capital of Spain, in Madrid, they decided to introduce the currency by 1999. And they named this currency the ECU, of course. But Germany, like I said, disliked the name of it because it had a French sounding. So the agreement was, let's call it the euro, just like Europe. Yeah, so it unites countries under this one name. Yeah, this is a very important issue. Single currency absolutely must have no inclinations to national identity. If there is a national identity in it, other countries will be opposing this currency. So I don't think that the United States would accept Russian rubles, or Japan accept Chinese yuan. This is impossible to think about such a way to name a currency. So this currency should have no nationality, so to speak. It should be a currency that unites everybody under the same roof. And they created the euro. The euro was introduced first as a digital currency in numbers. That was on January the 1st, 1999. It was introduced on the markets of Europe and it started trading. That was an experiment, of course. That was an experiment because nobody knew which way this currency is going to develop. Maybe it's going to be destroyed, right? It joined the market because this project was really phenomenal in those days, and no country in the world had such an experience to introduce a currency for 11 countries. First there were 11 countries who joined the monetary union, and later just before the introduction of the euro as real hard currency banknotes and coins in 2002, on January the 1st, 2002, Greece decided to join this union. That was a country, a 12th country to join the monetary union. People in Europe were very, very euphoric about the introduction of this currency. Just imagine Italians and the Greeks. They suffered from corruption and inflation, hyperinflation in their country. Lira was just like a Russian ruble in the early 1990s, with these several zeros. And it was it was very difficult to count in those numbers, to think in those numbers. And with 40% inflation rate annually, that was impossible to store this currency. It was ridiculous to store it, to save this currency. They were, of course, thinking about Germany with its hard currency. They thought if we join this union, Germany will care about us, and we will prosper, and everything will be all right. So when they went to shops next day, on January the 1st, that was aired on TV, this event, so people were very, very happy. The new year, the new currency, everything new. We enter the new millennium with a new currency, and a bright future lies ahead of us. So they were very, very enthusiastic, and Italians went to shops and they looked at those prices expressed in euros, 1 euro, 2 euro. It's so this is very cheap, they thought, because they got to pay millions of liras to buy the same goods, and they started consuming heavily. Later they decided, later they realized that that was ineffective and irrational to do. But this is a human nature. They were offered very good interest rates. In Italy, they had to pay, like we in Russia had to pay too dearly for loans. Now they pay less, and in Greece also they had to pay 20% annually for loans, and that was very, very difficult, and that was a burden, a great burden on the people and the economy. It was very difficult to do. And now they were really happy. First, the exchange rate of the euro to US dollar fluctuated downwards. That means they thought the euro was a weak currency. It would not be like a German Deutschmark. It would be a complete gimmick, and nobody will use it in the end. But later it started its upward trend, and from 86 cents it started quickly rising, and by the year 2007 it reached $1.50. That was an absolute height, an absolute maximum. Today we know it costs something like $1.13 or 11, and there was an idea that if it comes closer to 1-to-1, there would be a European crisis, and it really was getting closer to that 1-to-1 in January. But then this coronavirus thing happened and everything changed. Maybe that was part of the reason why there was not a currency crisis in Europe. But still the economic crisis happened instead in Europe. Everyone was expecting a currency crisis, But what really happened was a much more dangerous thing, a very complex thing that precipitated and triggered many other difficulties and crises in Europe that were unsolved during decades. In 2016, the European Union was shocked by the British idea and willingness to leave the European Union. This idea was first expressed in 2013 in January on the World Economic Forum in Davos. David Cameron, then Prime Minister of the UK from the Tory party, said that if you in Europe do not meet 5 criteria, that means improve your competitiveness in industry, agriculture, everywhere. Increase competitiveness. There were 5 points. If you do not comply, then we leave this union. There will be a referendum and we will leave the union. And everyone was shocked, of course. The French started thinking about new tariffs against the UK, and Germany as well wanted to join a sort of a international sanctions committee. So these threats became real. Everyone thought that that was a joke first, that Britain would not leave the EU because it was very difficult to do. Too many agreements were concluded. Too many paper was written in order to unite, in order to get closer. It was very difficult to get closer. Although Britain did not give up its currency, the British pounds, and that was a sort of a thing that saved them, maybe, or allowed them even to speak about leaving the EU. So it's as if they, before joining the EU completely, they wanted to have some sort of a mechanism that would allow them to exit. Because if they joined the European Monetary Union and introduced the euro instead of British pounds, it would have been much more difficult to live. Maybe even more dangerous to leave this. And maybe even they did not try to do that in the first place. Because as we see, in Greece and Italy, they spoke about leaving the European currency and reintroducing drachmas and liras. But time goes by, time passes by, and they're only talking and nothing and doing nothing. So they still are in the EU and the European Monetary Union. Now, what happens with the British leave? What happens? Britain is a very important economy in the European Union. This is not Slovakia. This is not Hungary. Yeah. British leave amounts to leaving 11 countries of the European Union, such as Hungary, Slovakia, Czech Republic, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Greece. So 11 countries altogether. 11 South European countries. Because British GDP amounts to something close to 2.5 trillion US dollars. And this is a very huge amount of money. And it amounts to leaving 11 countries in the European Union. So this is a very, very serious event for not only the UK, but also for the whole of Europe. Because European judgments European system of law, actually, because they've got not only European currency, the euro, they've got European Court of Justice, this is the single court, they have European Parliament, the legislative body, where each representative from each member country votes for legislation in the European Union. Then they've got European Central Bank, of course, European Commission, which is a sort of a board of ministers, like a government in a country. They've got a president, so they've got everything in common. And each agreement should be signed and agreed upon by all member states without any exceptions. There must be a unanimous vote and no veto. If somebody votes against, no legislation goes. Nothing works. So everyone should agree. They agreed upon one single currency, and they started feeling many economic problems after that. There were economic crises, especially in the weaker countries. They were called the pigs. Portugal, Ireland, Greece, and Spain, yeah? Pigs. These 5 countries were named pigs because they had large debts. In order to enter the European Monetary Union, you had to observe several rules, several criteria. First of all, your debt to GDP ratio must be 60%, not more than 60%. It could be 50, 40, but not 61. Yeah? So this is a limit, a cap, 60% debt to GDP ratio. Point number 2, inflation rate, not more than 2-3% annually. Point 3, budget deficit, not more than 2-3% of GDP budget deficit annually. There were other criteria, but in general these 3 criteria were the most important. Who in the European Union now observes these criteria? No one. Germany, and that was an example for everyone to follow. In 2007-2008, when the great financial crisis, world financial crisis hit, it had a debt to GDP ratio of 87%, so 27% more than agreed in Maastricht. Greece, 130%. Italy, 130%. Spain, 120% or something. So no country in the European Monetary Union observes these criteria to the full extent. Things started getting better. In 2015, 16, 17, Germany started to be again looking like an example country, and they managed to decrease that debt to GDP ratio down to 60%. But now the coronavirus crisis, and they had to issue more government debt in order to cope with, in order to help the economy recover. And now again, nobody in the European Union complies. So, a very serious issue, but everyone neglects it. As soon as this crisis started, people thought that maybe countries such as Greece, Italy, will leave the European Monetary Union and reintroduce drachmas and liras. So they started thinking about exchanging their currency, the euro, into something else. And they started looking at those banknotes and found a very distinctive thing. banknotes. The European Central Bank, although this is a single monetary body for the monetary union, has no right to issue the currency. So this is a central bank, but unlike the central banks in Japan, Russia, the United States, it has no right to issue the currency. What do they do there, those people? What do you people do at the European Central Bank? They discuss the level of the interest rate. Each month, today, Christine Lagarde goes on air and declares interest rate. Today it's 0. So you pay nothing for taking loans from European banks. Sometimes it's even minus something. Yeah, 2 countries in the world, Switzerland and Japan, have negative interest rates. Switzerland minus 0.075%, and Japan something close to that also. So you got to pay nothing. Yeah. Japan is an absolute record country in the world. It has the greatest debt to GDP ratio ever recorded in human history. 300% debt to GDP ratio. Yeah, we are talking about 87% in Germany, and this is not very good. But Japan has 300% debt to GDP ratio, and they still live there in Japan. And Japanese yen is a safe haven currency. When something bad happens on the markets, traders start buying whether gold, US dollars, and Japanese yen. They go into yen, so to speak. In Europe, this is quite a different thing. The European Central Bank has no right to issue the currency. It has no right to bail out countries and organize bailouts. And that was a very important point, actually, for the European Union and its existence. So you've got a single currency, but nobody responsible for this currency, because this currency is continued to be issued by the central banks that existed before the creation of the European Central Bank. So that means German Bundesbank, the central bank of Germany, still issues the euro for its currency, and it has a special series number on it. You know that each banknote in the world has a series number, and these numbers end with an X, a letter X. That means this currency was printed by the Bundesbank. So as soon as the crisis began, people started thinking about exchanging their euros printed in Spain, Greece, and Italy. You have special numbers, of course. In Greece, the Greek National Bank prints series numbers ending with Y. Y. Yeah. In Spain, they do it with S. In Germany, X. So they started thinking about converting those currency into banknotes bearing this series number. Of course, this sounds very strange and stupid, because each euro produced and issued on the territory of the European Union should be accepted everywhere in Europe. Even countries who are not part of the European Monetary Agreement, and we've got 17 country members of the European Monetary Agreement, and plus 10 countries who are in the EU but not in the European Monetary Union. So, for example, Poland, Czech Republic, these countries, 11 countries altogether, have their own currencies. Denmark has its own currency, Sweden has its own currency, and they still use it, their own currency. For example, Sweden uses Swiss krona, Czech Republic florins, Poland zloty, etc. They still use national currencies, and they do not want to join the European Monetary Union. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, former Soviet republics, introduced the euro in 2010s. So, again, many problems. Nobody is responsible for that currency because if we take an example from life, what kind of an example can we think of when we think about the common currency in Europe? Sometimes they speak about a communal flat in the Soviet Union. What is a communal flat in the Soviet Union, in the Communist Republic? This is a flat with 17 rooms, and each of these rooms represents one country of the European Union. And all these countries keep to themselves. They live inside in their rooms, and everything is perfect there. Picobello. Everything is beautiful. We keep our streets clean, and we are very good people. But we've got a common flaw, a common hole, which we all use to enter and exit this flat, right? And when you enter this hole, it is impossible to enter it, and it is very nasty, because some kind of broken bicycles lie there, broken everything, yeah, dirt and mud and things like that, because nobody is responsible for it. They all keep their flats, rooms in that flat, but not the floor. This is not our place. This is our place, but this is not ours. This is what euro is in the end. This common thing, which for nobody is responsible for it. No central bank, no authority is behind that. Coronavirus changed that. As soon as coronavirus started, and the countries of the European Union faced this dark future, they thought that this is the end, and nothing is going to save them. And they suddenly, that was absolutely a surprising thing to do. Nobody believed that in Europe that they would create a common debt. So they created common everything. They had common in each, almost each part of their human lives, but they had no common debt. So that means in Europe they had no right to issue euro bonds. Euro bonds are issued everywhere. In Russia we can issue euro bonds, price it in any possible currency, in the euro, in the US dollar, but in the European Union they were not allowed to issue government bonds expressed in euros, because if they do that, the Germans were afraid that they will pay for everyone right from their pockets. In Greece will have to be saved by German savings, by taxpayer money from Germany. So that was completely impossible. But Angela Merkel, German Chancellor, she is always listened to in the European Union, and French President Macron decided to come together and other countries followed, and they negotiated for 4 long days, days and nights, and that was a revolutionary agreement. They agreed upon a fund that would be responsible for the Eurobonds, and this fund would help the European countries hit by the crisis recover. So now they have a right to issue Eurobonds, and countries who have money will have to pay for that. And first, countries that are going to receive help include Italy with its 130% debt to GDP ratio, Greece, and Spain. These 3 countries, southern countries, are going to be the first. They're going to receive over 300 billion euros. This fund runs 750,000 euros, so almost 1 trillion euros. And that means they reached, like this article said, the journalist speculated, that Europe reached a Hamiltonian point. What is a Hamiltonian point? Who is Hamilton, by the way? Hamilton was a very famous minister in the US in the early days of the United States, back in the end of the 18th century. Hamilton was the Minister of Finance of the United States of America. The United States was a bunch of independent countries, so to speak, a bunch of independent states. They issued their own currencies. They called them dollars, but each state had the right to issue their currency. And actually, they were not afraid of doing that, because in the end, everything was priced in gold, because they lived under the gold standard. That was still possible in those days. Now, what he decided to do to get these countries closer, he wanted to introduce common debt idea, so that if your state is running huge debts, other states will come together and rescue you. And that was called the Hamiltonian idea, the Hamiltonian point. Hamilton created a common fiscal union in the United States. And now the states were allowed to run debts, their own debts, yeah? And what happened? They started speculating heavily and were heavily indebted to each other. There were bankrupt states, and other rich states had to pay for them. Those rich states, stable states, thought that that was unfair. What did you do with your Hamiltonian policy? And what happened? Civil war started in 1846, yeah, in Lincoln times. So, besides this problem of slave trade, there was this great problem of heavy debts. And what they had to do in the end? They had to abolish this fiscal union. So, upon this day, still, in the United States, no state is responsible for other states' debt. In 2008, California, the greatest state, the richest state in the United States, went bankrupt. Arnold Schwarzenegger led this richest state in the United States to the brink of collapse. And nobody was responsible for its debts. So they had to get out of this situation themselves. 8 states out of the 50 US states in the United States can go bankrupt.
Can I ask, but they usually have like common debts?
No, today they have no common debts.
So these figures on sum of debts of
Yeah,
states?
yeah. The federal debt, the debt of the states. So they've got the divisions there. Yeah, divisions. The federal budget, the budget of the states, and local budgets, and they are separated. Your question.
My question was about trade. When you told us that Germany was highly export country in 1950s and exported goods in exchange for dollars, the question is, why did they trade for dollars, not for their German currency at that time?
Because the world